Canada wasn't really born, it was built. And not all at once. It was pieced together, bit by bit, through bold promises, secret deals, and some pretty intense political brawls. It didn't come together from a single event, but was rather the result of political maneuvering, strategic alliances, and compromises, both big and small. Canada was not a spontaneous birth. It was a calculated, often reluctant construction that unfolded over decades. Most of us think of Confederation as a single event that happened in 1867, but honestly, that was just the beginning of the story. The idea of a unified Canada didn't just appear in 1867, it had been slowly percolating for years before, and its eventual realization involved more than just Ontario and Quebec. The process of becoming a united country was filled with negotiation, pressure, and often surprising motivations from its provinces and territories. From the threat of an American invasion to the lure of gold and the promise of a railway stretching across a continent, each province had its own unique and often surprising reason for signing up. And while we tend to view Canada's formation as a series of smooth, organized meetings, it was far from it. It was a complicated, messy process involving both local political struggles and broader national concerns. The conditions were ripe for change, but the timing was everything. So, how did a scattered collection of colonies become the second-largest country on Earth? How did British North America transform from a cluster of small colonies into a unified nation with a unique identity and a global footprint? Let's find out. Our story begins in the 1860s, a time of huge changes and a lot of uncertainty in British North America. The American Civil War had just torn apart the United States. And the idea of manifest destiny, the belief that the U.S. was meant to expand across the whole continent, cast a long, intimidating shadow over its northern neighbors. The U.S. was a growing power, and its expansionist ambitions, coupled with its volatile civil war, made many in Canada feel uneasy. There was a real fear that America might turn its eyes to the north and attempt to annex British North America. Meanwhile, Britain, still reeling from the costs of maintaining its vast empire, was growing tired of the expense and hassle of defending its scattered North American colonies. Britain no longer had the same interest in maintaining control over distant territories that didn't contribute significantly to the empire. It was time for its North American colonies to stand on their own 2 feet. Britain's government had begun to look for ways to reduce its role in North American affairs, leaving the colonies to figure out their own future. But the push for union didn't just come from external forces. It also came from within. Within the largest colony of them all, the province of Canada, the political situation was becoming increasingly untenable. Since 1841, Canada had been an uneasy marriage between 2 very different regions, Canada West and Canada East. Canada West was predominantly English-speaking and Protestant, while Canada East was largely French-speaking and Catholic. This division created tension, and while the 2 regions had been bound together under one government, the arrangement wasn't working. In fact, it was a ticking time bomb. Canada West and Canada East were stuck in a political system that was designed to assimilate the French Canadians, but instead created constant political gridlock. Each region had equal representation in the legislature, which meant for a law to pass, it required a double majority, a majority vote from both Canada West and Canada East. This system made it nearly impossible for the 2 regions to agree on anything, resulting in governments that rose and fell with alarming regularity. The political deadlock was paralyzing the colony's ability to function effectively. A solution was desperately needed. And the solution came in the form of a radical new vision for the future of British North America, a federal union that would unite Canada West, Canada East, and other British colonies into a single entity. This was the vision of a group of politicians, many of whom would become known as the Fathers of Confederation. One of the most significant figures in this effort was John A. Macdonald, a shrewd and ambitious politician from Canada West. MacDonald was driven by a vision of building a powerful, united country that could stand up to the growing influence of the United States. Another key figure was Georges-Étienne Cartier from Canada East, who believed that Confederation would give Quebec the ability to protect its unique French culture, language, and Catholic religion. Together, they saw the possibility of a federal union of Canada where each province could manage its own affairs, but national issues like defense and trade would be controlled by a strong central government. But to make this vision a reality, MacDonald and Cartier needed more than just Ontario and Quebec. The success of the project depended on convincing the maritime colonies New Brunswick, Nova Scotia, and Prince Edward Island to join the Union. The Maritimers, though, were deeply skeptical. They had strong identities, thriving economies built on shipbuilding, trade, and natural resources, and they were reluctant to give up their independence to become part of a larger political entity. In 1864, the Maritimes were already discussing the possibility of their own union. They were considering forming a regional federation that would provide more economic stability and political security. But MacDonald and Cartier, along with other Canadian leaders, saw an opportunity to pitch their much grander vision to the Maritimers. The problem was, they couldn't just wait for an invitation. They had to crash the party. In a bold and risky move, they showed up at the Charlottetown Conference in 1864, a meeting where the Maritimes were planning to discuss their own smaller union. At first, the Maritimers were taken aback, but MacDonald and Cartier presented their case, arguing that a larger federal union, one that included the provinces of Canada, would be far more beneficial. They offered a promise that proved irresistible: a transcontinental railway that would connect the ice-free ports of the Maritimes to the economic heartland of Quebec and Ontario, opening up new markets and boosting trade. This was a huge offer. The Maritimes, facing their own economic challenges and fearful of being swallowed by the growing United States, began to reconsider. The offer of the intercolonial railway was the hook that got the maritime colonies on board. New Brunswick, with its vulnerable southern border, saw the Union as an opportunity for security. It quickly voted in favor. Nova Scotia, however, was much more divided. Premier Charles Tupper was fully in favor of Confederation, but a large portion of the population, led by the fiery and influential speaker Joseph Howe, was fiercely opposed. Howe argued that Confederation would strip Nova Scotia of its independence, its wealth, and its unique identity. Despite Howe's fierce opposition, Tupper, with the backing of London, managed to push the deal through. The Nova Scotia entry into Confederation wasn't smooth. In fact, when the deal was made official, Nova Scotians elected anti-Confederation politicians in the very first federal election, after 1867. However, it was too late. The deal had already been struck, and Nova Scotia became part of the new Dominion of Canada. And so, on July 1, 1867, the British North America Act was proclaimed, and the Dominion of Canada was born. Canada's four founding provinces, Ontario, Quebec, New Brunswick, and Nova Scotia, came together to form the new nation. The Union was a bold experiment in federalism, created out of a need for political stability, economic growth, and a shared fear of the growing power of the United States. But this was just the beginning. The map of Canada was far from complete, and the process of nation-building was far from over. The birth of Canada was not a smooth, orderly affair. It was a collection of compromises, political negotiations, and, yes, a good deal of pushing and pulling. But it marked the beginning of a new country, and it set the stage for the future growth of Canada. A growth that would unfold over the next several decades. With the foundations set in the east, the new Dominion of Canada immediately looked west. The massive, sparsely populated territory stretching to the Rocky Mountains, known as Rupert's Land, was a huge prize. For centuries, it had been the private playground of the Hudson's Bay Company, a fur-trading empire. But for Prime Minister John A. Macdonald, it was the key to his vision of a Canada that stretched from sea to sea, uniting the country from the Atlantic to the Pacific. In 1869, Canada arranged to purchase this vast land from the HBC for $1.5 million, a sum that seemed relatively small for the enormous stretch of territory. But there was just one tiny problem. No one bothered to ask the 12,000 people who actually lived there. These were of the Red River settlement. There were a unique people of mixed First Nations and European heritage, with their own culture, language, and land system, based on long riverfront lots perfect for farming. They had a rich history in the region and had long been allies with the HBC, helping to run the fur trade. When Canadian surveyors showed up in the fall of 1869 and began laying out a square grid system right on top of the farms, it was seen as an insult. The grid was incompatible with the system of land tenure, and it was a direct threat to their way of life. The surveyors were essentially erasing the long-held land rights, and the local people would have none of it. A small group of unarmed, led by a passionate 25-year-old Louis Riel, stepped forward to stop the work. Riel, who had been educated in Montreal, was an intellectual with a strong sense of justice for his people. His stand, as small as it seemed, quickly escalated into the Red River resistance. Riel and formed a provisional government to take control of the settlement. They weren't trying to overthrow Canada or disrupt the new nation. They simply wanted to be heard. Riel and his supporters took control of the HBC's main post at Upper Fort Garry, issued a list of rights, and demanded the right to join Confederation as a full province, not just as a territory. They wanted guarantees for their language, religion, and land rights, as well as the recognition of their cultural distinctiveness within the new nation. Back in Ottawa, Macdonald's government was under increasing pressure. The resistance was gaining momentum, and Macdonald knew that to keep the West from falling into chaos, he would have to negotiate. Talks between and the Canadian government were slow, but they were happening. However, the resistance took a tragic turn. Riel's government tried Thomas Scott, an aggressive and openly anti-Ontarian who had been captured during an attempt to take control of the fort. Scott was executed by firing squad, an act that shocked the country, particularly in Protestant Ontario, where the news caused an uproar. Riel was branded a murderer, and the tension between and the rest of Canada grew. But despite the backlash, the negotiations continued. In 1870, the Manitoba Act was passed, and Manitoba became Canada's fifth province. Initially, Manitoba was a small province almost, a postage stamp around the Red River, but the act included many of the protections they had fought for, such as guarantees for French language rights and a promise of land for children. Despite the political firestorm caused by Scott's execution, Louis Riel became widely regarded as the founder of Manitoba, and his actions helped bring the West into the fold of Canada. But while the West was being shaped through resistance, promises, and political wrangling, another story was unfolding in the Pacific. The colony of British Columbia was struggling. The gold rush of the 1850s had fizzled out, leaving the colony with a small population and crippling debt. By the time of Confederation, British Columbia had little to show for its past economic booms. British Columbia had three options. It could remain a struggling British colony, could look to join the growing United States, which had much stronger economic ties with the West Coast, or it could make a leap of faith and join the newly formed Dominion of Canada. In the 1870s, a group of ambitious leaders, led by a passionate newspaper publisher who had changed his name from William Smith to the more dramatic Amour de Cosmos, campaigned hard for British Columbia to join Canada. They argued that joining Canada would not only help alleviate the colony's financial woes, but also provide security against the ever-expanding American West. Prime Minister Macdonald saw the potential for a larger Canada and made the bold promise that, in exchange for British Columbia joining, the Canadian government would take on the colony's debt and provide security. Most importantly, Macdonald promised to build a transcontinental railway connecting Ottawa to Victoria. This was an audacious offer, one that would stretch Canada's resources thin. But it was a gamble that British Columbia could not afford to pass up. For British Columbia, the railway was the lifeline they needed. In 1870, British Columbia sent a delegation to Ottawa to hammer out the details. The terms were simple but monumental. Canada would assume British Columbia's debt, and the railway would be built. The promise was bold, and the scale of the railway project seemed almost impossible. But for British Columbia, it was the best option available. On July 20, 1871, British Columbia became Canada's 6th province. And the building of the Canadian Pacific Railway became the defining challenge of Canada's early years. Critics back east were wary of the enormous costs and engineering challenges involved in constructing such an ambitious project. But Macdonald was undeterred, and the promise of the railway solidified British Columbia's place in the new Dominion. The from sea to sea vision began to take shape. By 1873, most of the original colonies had joined the Dominion of Canada, but one holdout remained: Prince Edward Island. Despite its small size and economic challenges, Prince Edward Island was fiercely independent. The island had a long history of British colonial rule and was proud of its autonomy. When Confederation was first proposed in 1867, the islanders rejected the idea, seeing little benefit in joining a larger country. However, by 1871, things had changed. Prince Edward Island had attempted to build its own railway, but the project ended in disaster. It was plagued by corruption, financial mismanagement, and cost overruns, leaving the island drowning in debt. The island's government, struggling to keep the colony afloat, came to the painful realization that Confederation might be the only way out. Ottawa seized the opportunity. In exchange for joining Canada, the federal government agreed to take on the island's railway debt, buy out absentee landlords who had owned most of the island's land, and guarantee year-round ferry service to the mainland. The deal was a lifeline for a colony in crisis. On July 1, 1873, Prince Edward Island finally joined the Dominion of Canada as its 7th province. It was a reluctant decision, made not out of ideological alignment, but out of cold, hard financial necessity. It was an agreement that saved the island from economic collapse and solidified the growing country's eastern border.